Hey everyone, just letting you know, Niels had a wisdom tooth removal surgery this week, so there's no recap since we didn't feel like we need to record this week when he's still recovering from surgery. So just as a little disclaimer, no recap this week, but the episode is here. Let's join in on Game Master Etiquette. Have fun. So, Niels, there's been a recent post on social media, Twitter, I don't know where else, by the way. I've seen it on Twitter, from MT Black, who is a freelance tabletop game designer that has designed parts of D&D adventures, that has designed their own D&D games or D&D adventures, and also some official materials. Yeah, very knowledgeable, very veteran in the scene, more or less, in the creation scene and in the D&D scene itself. And MT Black has used his following to basically make a poll about what they would want a dungeon master to be like, or what they are like as a dungeon master, and basically from that compiled a list of rules for dungeon master etiquette. Mm-hmm. He has also done one of these rule sets or etiquette sets on player etiquette already, as far as I know, but we're not going to be talking about that today. We're only here to talk about the dungeon master etiquette thing and what we think of every rule, if we think there's something missing, and if we basically disagree on certain things or if we don't. Obviously, as always, right, this is just a discussion, this is our opinion, this is, right, it's just normal. This doesn't mean this is polled by thousands of people. So obviously there's going to be a lot of truth in that because MT Black has compiled a lot of different answers into just 7 rules, but there might also be obvious things missing that maybe have been omitted for reasons that we don't know. So this is not to critique necessarily what these rules are. This is just we can get to discussing dungeon master etiquette because I think it is a very important topic to discuss.
Yeah, definitely. Especially in regards to subreddits, for example, like TTRPG horror stories and stuff. If GMs stick more to a good etiquette in general, without necessarily now defining what it is or what makes that or what this consists of, most of the stuff in TTRPG horror stories would be thrown out of the window with ease.
I mean, at least all that come from a horror GM, right?
Exactly. Since we are talking about GMing etiquette and not player etiquette, but yeah, I would say roughly 90 to 95% of these posts would just be gone and not have been made if everyone would roughly stick to some sort of etiquette.
Yeah, and let's be real. Something that we as a space need to accept or shouldn't necessarily accept, but need to know is that there is a lot of horror stories out there. I mean, the RPG horror stories subreddit has nearly 300,000 members. Now, we can talk about what that means, but I think there's like roughly 15, 20 stories a day posted in that subreddit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we say that's roughly 70% of those are GM stories and 30% of those are player stories or whatever, because I think a lot of the horrors at a table come more often from the GM side.
Yeah.
Because it is a more controlling position. It is a more powerful position, which leads to more horror stories in that regard. And we need to accept that there is a lot of bad, horrible GMs out there that do stuff. Most of the time, I will even say, maybe unknowingly that they are doing it. Because, right, they have no better idea. They don't know any better. They have never, because dungeon mastering or game mastering is a thing that it is taught. I mean, there are shows like DoubleDM that teach you how to be a good dungeon master, I would say. But even that is something, right? It is my perspective of how to be a good GM.
Exactly.
Not everyone's perspective is the same. But generally, there is not necessarily that much stuff out there for being a good GM, right? Because it is such a unique and individual task that it's very hard to be. It's not very hard to be a good GM, but it's very easy to fall into a trap and become one of these horror bad GMs because one mishap could already lead to such a horror story. Now, that might not be necessarily good in itself, that one failure on your part can already lead to players disliking your playstyle. That can also be a bad thing and it's kind of toxic. However, right, just because of how the hobby hobby is and how the position that you're in is, it is very hard to find good advice. Or not necessarily, it's not very hard to find good advice. It's just very hard to, I don't want to say understand what you're doing.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying, because being a GM is a very subjective and individual process or situation. And even though it is catered basically to you as a GM, every group you GM for has a different understanding of what a good GM is and what isn't. And what can be an amazing GM for one group can be a horrible GM for another group. If you just played with one group over and over again and you nailed that, you got that down, perfect GM for that group, and then play with a different group that doesn't like that, bam, and suddenly you are a quote-unquote horrible GM without ever changing anything, just because it's a different playstyle from what you usually play, or the players have a different playstyle than what your usual group plays with, that you've accustomed.
I mean, a lot of the resources, and it's not even resources for TTRPGs in the space, are actual play. And this is where a lot of these horror stories sometimes also stem from, right? I have a Matt Mercer GM that wants to have the group be exactly like the Critical Role table or something like that, right? That is also part of a horror story, because a lot of the materials out there aren't materials but are actual plays, and the GM that has started because of these materials, of these actual plays, wants to be like that GM, because that is their vision of a perfect good GM, and they're doing that. But what you first need to realize, which is a kind of hard realization, is GMing is a unique and individual craft of your own. There is no one out there that can perfectly show you how to do it. And yet still, we're here to talk about these etiquette rules, because I think these 7 etiquette rules, one thing that they do very well is very simply be applicable to at least 95% of the time you're playing, because they're so broad and easy to understand. That also means that there are some parts where I would say there's an easy example to be made, that where this rule doesn't apply or where this rule fails, maybe. But that isn't the point, right? The point is that you are easily able to navigate being a GM thanks to these 7 rules. And that is a great thing, because these rules have been polled by 1,000 people, then compiled by a very good craftsman of GMing, and have now been discussed online to be maybe even better in a new revised version, if that one ever comes out. I mean, the discussions around these rules have mostly been positive at all. Like, this is great, I love these, and I can already take this away. We will love most of these rules anyway. Maybe some wording won't fit us, but generally these 7 rules are good rules.
Yeah, the general vibe of everything that is in that list is pretty good.
Yeah, but we still can and should discuss them, especially since we're a podcast about game mastering and dungeon mastering.
Exactly.
They're a very good topic to talk about. And we've never had an episode on dungeon master etiquette per se, so why not talk about them? So how this is going to go is we're going to go and change, right? You start, I go, you start, then the next rule is mine, then the next rule is yours. So you take the first rule, read the entire rule out loud for the class, and then we can discuss if maybe some of the wording doesn't fit or what we think of the rule.
Yeah. All right. Then let's just dive right in with the first one. Consistency is key. Apply the rules consistently. Be clear about whether you're using official rules or house rules, and ensure that players understand and experience them uniformly throughout the campaign. If you need to make a change, communicate the reasons why and get a player buy-in. In the same way, present the game world details as consistently as possible. This greatly aids player immersion.
Okay, so my first thing about this rule is actively that I don't think it is a good first rule.
Yeah.
I like the rule a lot, because consistency is key. I've said that before 1,000 times, especially in what you're communicating to your players, in your game worlds, in your GMing style. But at the same time, I don't think it is a good first rule for these 7 rules.
Yeah.
I understand why it's at the top, because its first sentence is, be clear about whether you apply these rules consistently, right? These 7 rules that will now follow should be applied consistently. That's why this rule is first. And that is true. These rules should be applied consistently. And when you're consistent as a GM, it is easy for your players to understand what you're doing.
Yeah.
If you're GMing consistently, your players will have a better time at your tables. And that is true. I just don't think that this rule is a good first rule for these 7 rules. Because I think there are more. The other rules say something more important than this rule. So I would have put this rule on the 7th place at the end. Now that you've read all rules, memorize them and be consistent in your rulings within them.
Exactly. I totally agree. It's an amazing rule, basically, to have nearly everything as close to the same thing before as possible. So it's a more or less uniform style that everyone can get accustomed to. Especially the style element is, in that regard, I think, pretty big to talk about, because every group has a different play style and all of that. Every GM has that. But if you're consistently using the same style for more than one session, your players can get accustomed to that style and see if that works for them or not. And then then as a group make a decision if the game itself is something for this group or not, or this one person in that group or whatever. And therefore, consistency not only helps with creating a more immersive and a better game, but also a more engaging table environment and group dynamic, because everyone is on the same page on how this is going to go. The basic craft of it behind everything, every description, everyone is on the same page on that.
I think the only criticism that I've already mentioned, right, that this rule is the first and not the last, is I don't know if these rules have been weighted by how important they are by MT Black, because it's not stated anywhere in the document or on the Twitter post or whatever. So this is definitely not to say that MT Black did a bad job of ranking these rules, because maybe it's just the first that he wrote down after having seen all the replies. Because, right, I just think if you list them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a lot of people might assume that this is the golden rule. And I think out of these 7 rules, it isn't the golden rule for me. There's a different rule in these 7 rules that I think is the golden rule. And I think there's one very tiny detail about this rule that I think is interesting to talk about, because what does consistency mean as a dungeon master? What does consistency in your style mean? You're allowed to have bad days where you're GMing not to the best of your ability. You're allowed to try out new different styles, but you're still supposed to be consistent in what you do. Your players should be understanding what is happening. That is what consistency means here, right? It's not supposed to mean that you should do the same thing over and over again. It's not like in a job where you're supposed to do consistently the same work. I am always supposed to do these certain things when I start my workday, for example, right? I have a routine of like 20, 30 minutes for my work days that I have to do every single workday I clock into work, because that is what the consistency needs. I need to answer every single email and message I get. I need to check in with the system if it's still working and stuff like that. And I need to test a few things always. That is consistency. I always do these things in the first half hour. Everyone can expect me to do them. In TTRPGs, which is a creative craft, you have not necessarily that consistency, but you should be consistent enough to let your players and other people at the table understand what is happening and can engage on that.
Exactly. Being clear about what you're trying to do, or if you're trying new things, is a form of consistency itself. Just being open and clearly stating what is going on. And there's one little thing in the wording which I would like to challenge, is the present the game world details as consistently as possible. That can be misleading. I think I know what this is trying to say, but I'm not sure this is a good tip or a etiquette rule or whatever, because depending on what you're trying to describe, it might be better to describe it visually, or describe the visuals, the sounds, or engage any other sense and focus more on one of those. This sense can change from situation to situation, but I think the consistency part here would be to focus on the most interesting and most immersive sense of what you're trying to describe. But in general, be consistent, but some might read it as describe everything the same way. Always start with this, always end with this. But I think consistency is more about, in this case, more about the openness and being consistent in the ways of I'll use the best description for that certain situation to engage engage the players the most. That I think is the best interpretation of being consistent in a description of the world details.
Okay, rule number 2: respect player agency. Value and respect your players. That means respecting their characters, their decisions, and their creativity. If a player uses an ability or item effectively or creatively, reward this ingenuity rather than looking for ways to counter it. This encourages players to pay attention, think laterally, and engage more deeply with the game. And avoid overriding player decisions or dictating character reactions, as this is a quick way to get players to disengage.
Oh yeah, I think this is a big one. This is a big one. It's super important to respect player agency. I mean, we are playing a TTRPG that is a story game with two driving forces. These two driving forces should always be there. Without agency, there aren't any two. There is just one. And I think this is the core mechanic, quote unquote, of TTRPGs. Having two driving forces, having a call and a response, and then the response side calls again, and then the GM side responds. You know, by eliminating that, you kind of dismantle the TTRPG you are playing at its core, and that's not fun for anyone, really. So I 100% agree with respecting your player's agency, because that's just super fucking important.
Yeah, this is very, very good advice. It's also not my golden rule of these 7, but it is, my opinion, more important than the consistency rule.
Yeah.
Because this is a rule where you actively get something that is very applicable to the game. It is very easy to understand what you're supposed to do here, because there's an active example, more or less. If one of your players does something very cool and ingenious, let them do it, engage them on it, reward it instead of countering it. Even though I think, right, now this is basically Dungeon Master 101, and now we come to Dungeon Master 102, where you're not supposed to counter it. Your NPCs and villains especially should look for a way to counter it. What you should do when your villains look to counter it, when you think of a way how your villains could counter that, is make that the rewarding part. Showing that the villain now has to think of a way to counter it. Showing that your game has been shaken by the player and is now looking for a response. That is part of the reward. The reward then should also be giving them what they want, what they wanted to achieve, and doing even more than that, right? They are tricksy. One of your players literally outsmarted the dragon. That should be some kind of very big reward. Either maybe that dragon's loyalty as a friend, or maybe the dragon, or you are able to steal from the horde or something, right? Whatever. But while maybe another villain is thinking of a response to that, you should make your game moving, right? This is not necessarily part of these etiquette rules, because that might be going a little bit too overboard, because I think this rule is perfect in and of itself. But just right, when MT Black, or when this rule is saying you're not supposed to think of a way to counter it, it's not meaning that there shouldn't be a way to counter it. It should just be that you should way more focus on actually rewarding the player for what they just did.
Exactly. There's just one thing in there that could be kind of weird, and that is dictating character reactions. I totally agree that you shouldn't do that, but there are some mechanics in some games that dictate certain feelings. For example, in D&D, the frightened condition. Your character is frightened per rules. How that manifests is up to the character. But you as a GM have to dictate, hey, your character is fucking frightened. What you do with that and how you portray it is completely up to you. There we go with the player agency again. But the core is, hey, or your character is charmed, or
I am blocking certain paths for you now because of the game.
Exactly. It's not because I want to. It's because you failed that saving throw. Your character is now charmed, frightened, blah, 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 blah. In that regard, you shouldn't dictate how the reactions play out, but what they entail, or rather what caused them, and then the cause for their reaction should be dictated at some points in the game. So let's go on with the third one. Be prepared and knowledgeable. Ensure you have a solid grasp on the game rules. You don't need to be an expert, but you should understand the fundamentals. Prepare adequately for each session. The level of preparation required can differ among GMs, as some are naturally adept at improvisation. Determine the amount of prep you personally need to ensure a good session. A knowledgeable and prepared GM facilitates a smoother and more immersive experience for the players.
I think this rule is also very, very great, because it is focusing on something I very, very much need the space to talk about. A lot of the times, loud voices in the TTRPG space are all about improvisation. Or prep less, prep less, prep less. And I think that advice is good. But what that advice always should entail is saying prep less for your standard.
Exactly.
Do what makes you comfortable when GMing. It is not about being the one that preps the least. It is about being comfortable with running a session for your friends at the table. That can involve as much prep as you need, and no one else can sour that amount of prep you do. If someone comes to you with, hey, I think you could do less prep here, and then talks to you about it, that is something different. But a lot of the times, right, I see a lot of loud voices going, you need to prep less, improvisation is the best thing about TTRPGs, blah, 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 blah. And I agree to a certain extent, but I always feel to myself, but what about those people that are not good at improvising? Mm-hmm. They should have a seat at the table too, and they need more prep. Let them do their prep. And I know a lot of people obviously would never sour that experience for someone when they say improvise more, prep less, but it always feels that way. And I think just saying that part out loud in these rules is very important, especially for a newcomer to the hobby.
Exactly. I think this is the big thing, and it goes hand in hand with the first rule that we discussed, that consistency is key. Prepare as much as you need for a good and amazing and comfortable session for you as a GM, and be consistent in that, more or less. Of course, there are days where you prep more or less, and depending on your situation, blah, 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 outside factors, you know the drill. But overall, preparing the way that you are comfortable running a session, or the amount that you need to run a session comfortably, and preparing that amount consistently, while that amount can change depending on how long you've already jammed, is a good link to the first rule, basically, that we discussed. And I totally agree, especially for newer GMs, as you said, the amount or in comparison to quote unquote veteran GMs, there is a disparity between the amount of prep that people might need, GMs might need. And that is only natural, because the way it is when you GM more, you learn more, you know more already. You don't have to prep everything. And therefore you have the knowledge that that in this post is mentioned by knowing the fundamentals. But first of all, you have to learn the fundamentals. That might take some time. So prepare them for every session first. Yeah. And once you have them down, don't prepare them anymore, because, hey, you don't have to.
Ta-da!
Ta-da!
Yeah, no, I agree. Rule number 4. Honor player boundaries and foster inclusion. Be attentive to your players' comfort levels and boundaries. Avoid introducing content that may be inappropriate. Do not show favoritism towards some players. Rather, ensure the spotlight is shared around equally. In the same way, do not hold grudges against a player. Indeed, avoid being adversarial, and instead treat all players in a fair and welcoming manner.
This period, basically.
It is such a good, concise rule and needed to be said. I mean, it sounds so simple, but there were tables I was at where that didn't feel like the case. And I'm not going to be saying that it's necessarily that easy as a GM to be attentive of all boundaries and all comfort levels at all times. No, it isn't. But you have easy ways to make sure to get your players comfortable, to make sure you know your players' comfort levels, right?
Hey,
safety tools. That is the one thing I think that this rule kind of is missing for me. It is the exact mentioning of use safety tools. I don't necessarily understand why it hasn't been said in this rule. I'm not going to be here to say MT Black doesn't believe in safety tools. I have no fucking idea if he does or not. I assume he does believe in them and uses them. With this rule maybe just having been compiled from 1,000 different answers, it could be that exact wording just fell under the table. It's a minor thing. It should have been mentioned for me, because I think that exact mentioning would have given new GMs a way to instantly get into safety tools and understand them and use them correctly. Yeah. Because that rule is a pure safety tool. Even though the word isn't mentioned, even though some people might think that safety tools are more than just understanding each other and being friendly with each other and honoring what the other person wants and needs, no, that is the most important safety tool. It is the safety tool. It is the basis of all safety tools.
Yeah.
Other safety tools just make that easier. finding those comfort levels, knowing those player boundaries. That is what safety tools are supposed to do.
Exactly.
The rule itself is great, but I think that it could have just been said, use a safety tool. They make it easy for you to understand those comfort levels and get those player boundaries. So you have an easy way to understand everything and know how to navigate it all. Because that's what you want. You don't want to offend anyone. That is so easy, clear. That's etiquette 101, not even Dungeon Master etiquette 101. It's literal pure basis human level.
Let's just be a fucking person. You should know that, period.
But it's very well put for a GM here, right? You are in a position where you could show favoritism. You are in a position where you can shine the spotlight. So use that ability responsibly and make sure everyone feels a shared experience around the table. Perfect.
I just have one addendum to the spotlight thing.
Yeah.
I totally agree that overall, over the course of the game that you're playing, however long it may be, the spotlight should be shared more or less equally, roughly the same percentages. But in one session of a longer going campaign, that doesn't always need to be the case. Because if you're in a character arc, in regards to the respecting player agency and their decisions and character, blah, 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 in some way, if they are in their character arc, a story that they have driven forward and are currently the main focus of that certain story beat, why not put more spotlight on that? But overall, more or less consistent spotlight, this more or less being consistent with the amount of spotlight that you put on people. And therefore, consistency is key, blah, it always links kind of back. But
I feel one big thing about this is it doesn't need to be exact or precise in how much spotlight everyone has. You just need to watch out that it doesn't feel, that it doesn't necessarily feel like you're ignoring one of the players or one of their characters. It is okay, right, if at the end of a session, if you would tally it all up, one of the player characters clearly has more focus than the others. That could be for many different reasons. It doesn't have to be favoritism. As long as everyone at the table doesn't feel left out, it is okay. Someone might like to be a little bit less in the spotlight for personal reasons. Maybe their character doesn't necessarily do all of the front work or whatever, and that's okay. But it always needs to be made sure that everyone feels good with the spotlight and not like they are left out.
Yeah, there we are again with the player boundaries and comfort levels.
Yeah.
Hey, use safety tools and check in with your players. Ka-ching.
Step 1, use safety tools. Step 2, profit.
Exactly. You don't even need a step 2 before the profit. Easy peasy. Anyways, 5th one, avoid overbearing control. While guiding the game, avoid being overly controlling in your storytelling. Allow space for a player-driven narrative and be flexible enough to adapt when players take unexpected paths. Where possible, incorporate changing character goals into the campaign. Avoid lengthy lore dumps or sessions dominated by exposition. And instead, balance DM narrative with layer interaction.
I mean, yeah, this is entirely true. It is the backbone of the medium of TTRPGs to have player or character-driven places, character-driven narratives. The entire medium is based on these characters that people have created going through someone's story or just their story and making an impact, in my opinion. And overbearing control means, you're kind of stifling that point specifically. It cannot be a good thing to be too controlling. I think this rule does a great job of explaining that you should do it. It doesn't necessarily say why you should do it. Most of the rules don't say necessarily why you should do it. But right in this instance, right, it could be that a lot of people might misunderstand this rule as you're not allowed to do anything with your storytelling, which isn't the case. And this rule doesn't say that, but it might be interpreted that way by especially a newcomer. It comes into the hobby and sees this rule and thinks, okay, so I'm not allowed to tell a story. You are allowed to tell a story. Your story just needs to be the same as that of the characters.
Exactly.
And you need characters for a good story. You're not able to control the characters. So don't try to make a good story without characters, because it won't be a good story. You need those good characters, and when you have those good characters, your story will be good. You can create a very great villain, you can create a great world, but you need those characters. You're reliant on them as much as those characters are reliant on your game.
Exactly. Let's look at this from a literature perspective, to have a simile here. You as a GM create the world, the antagonist of every book, of every story that you write. The world around it, the non-protagonists and the antagonists. But if you have all of that, and it's amazing, cool and all, but if the protagonists are shit and just completely forced in certain directions, it just feels weird, bad, meh. So we are again at the point with two driving forces of a story. You need good protagonists and a good world. If you don't have both, doesn't work.
Yeah. And this rule kind of just supports, especially the second rule, respect player agency. Mm-hmm. It supports that rule very, very well, because if you control too much, you stifle all agency out of the game. You make sure your players disengage from the game. They can't do anything because, you're controlling everything. And it's great that this rule is part of these 7 rules, because it is needed for this discussion to have that rule in there to talk about this. I'm going to say that you're allowed to have some control in your story. You're allowed to be having your story, and you're supposed to have fun too. You're supposed to tell your story too. You just need to make sure that you never think of your story more high than the player characters. I find, You're allowed to say my story is also important, my world is also important, and I want this to be want those things to be important. But if you put them clearly above the player characters, the players will notice, maybe even subconsciously, and disengage from the game.
Exactly. There's just, again, one little addendum. It's the example that is given with avoid lengthy lore drops or sessions dominated by exposition. Depending on what your characters want to do, this might be a necessity. Yeah. If your players want to go into a library and research, of course you have to do a lot of exposition and lore dumps, because when they want to learn about the history of the place they are going.
I mean, the thing is, lore dumps are a thing in TTRPGs, which I think have a lot of bigger negative connotation than they are actually worth, because you can make them engaging and fun.
Yeah.
But this is way too much to talk about in these rules, so I understand why it's in there, Because when you think of lore dumps, you think of the GM just talking for 2 hours about their world, and no one enjoys that.
Exactly.
I can understand that, and that is the case, period.
Or the exposition one. If you enter the villain's lair for the first time, of course you're gonna get a lot of exposition, because there are all of these important details, important things that are super impactful on the story that the characters are living, that they're experiencing. So there might be sessions dominated by exposition, because new things fall into place depending on the player's actions. But that's the big part of all of these negatively connotated session types, quote unquote. If they are engaged by the players or started by the actions of the players, that's fine. Don't shy away from them if that's what your players want, if that's what your players initiate. That's just one thing that I wanted to put out there.
Yeah, it's very important. Rule number 6, communicate clearly and effectively. Keep communication with your players clear and direct. When introducing new rules or making other significant decisions, discuss these openly with your group to maintain transparency and clarity. At the start of each session, provide a simple recap of the last session, and don't be afraid to ask your players clarifying questions, especially when they are describing character actions. And just before you get in on this rule, this is my golden rule. This should have been rule number 1.
Exactly.
Because I think it is so applicable to any other rule in this entire thing. Any other rule of these is supported and bettered and maybe even overshadowed by this rule.
Exactly.
Another rule can be completely taken out of the equation if it is communicated clearly why.
And I think this is even more the core of TTRPGs than just having a quote-unquote just having a story with 2 driving forces and collaborative storytelling and all of that. Yeah. But there's the point. It's collaborative. It's a social game. You need communication between everyone at the table, between the players themselves, between the GM and the players. And everything needs just to be clearly communicated. And if that is not the case, none of the other rules basically matter, in quotation marks, because if you change something or if you're inconsistent with a certain thing, but you don't explain why, that's bad. But if you are excluding something from the equation or not be consistent with that little detail, but communicate why, even if it just might be, hey, trust me, you will find out later, it would be a major spoiler for any fun shit that is going on next session or something along those lines. Something of, hey, this wasn't just a mistake, this was on purpose for reasons that I can't tell you without spoiling your fun. All of that. Communication. It's the basis of what we do, because when you as a player just say what a character wants to do, there it is. You say stuff. You need to communicate properly. The same thing goes for GMs. Your world does something. You need to communicate that properly. Have a ruling on this ambivalently worded rule. You need to communicate why you chose that or that interpretation over the other. Your characters are afflicted by a condition. Communicate why they are inflicted by this condition and what that condition entails, so the players can make informed decisions on how to act next. Communication is so fucking important.
Yeah.
But so overlooked in nearly any discussion in the TTRPG space.
I don't think anymore, necessarily.
It was, but because a lot of people, at least when I started playing, that's where that was coming from, were seeing this as just a storytelling medium, just a way to have a video game on paper.
Be more interactive.
Yeah.
I think after having played and experienced and read a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, right? That the way that Powered by the Apocalypse games often say the game is just a conversation has helped me understand so much of how I think of TTRPGs now and want to enjoy them. It is, we are sitting around the table for 4 hours or 5 hours or even just 2 hours or even an hour only. And we're just talking about a shared fiction. Nothing more. We can dismantle every rule, everything in the game, every construct there is, as long as we have agreed on it by talking to each other.
Exactly.
We can drive it in any direction we want, as long as we talk to each other. And no game is worse off when you just do that communication. Like when you as a player think, okay, I want this game to be driven into that direction, whatever direction that is, you are allowed to say out of character, hey guys, what do you all think of this? You are allowed to. It's not metagaming. You are allowed to. You should do it. It is easy. It is simple. It is not necessarily often advised to people to break the shared fiction and talk about stuff outside that fiction.
That just relates to every other rule that we've read before, because, hey, every rule beforehand had at its core, talk to your players and let them talk to you and have an open dialogue about everything that is going on. So important to keep a comfortable, steady, and amazing immersive game going, where everyone feels just safe and has fun. Anyways, next rule would be number 7, the encourage mutual respect. Foster an environment of respect where both GM and players feel heard and valued. Encourage players to actively listen when others are taking their turn. This creates a collegial table environment and often leads to excellent role-playing moments. Check in with players after heavy sessions, or if you think someone's boundaries were violated. Resolve conflicts quickly and directly rather than ignoring them.
I mean, this rule is basically a very good rule at the end. It's tying up the entire 7 rules that we've just read through. It is kind of a little bit overlapping with, I think, especially rule 4, right? Honor player boundaries, foster inclusion, encourage mutual respect. Those things go hand in hand. Like most of these things do. They all go hand in hand, but these 2 rules go very hand in hand. But I think it is a very important thing to state just as an extra again, because it cannot be stated as often as possible. It can just be stated as much as you want. Fostering an environment of respect is the basis of communication happening. This could also be the golden rule, in my opinion. I think the communication is still better because I think most tables already have that respect and mutual inclusion and mutual respect at the table. But I think this is a very important first step to actually being a good table for everyone involved. Yeah. You need to respect each other. And how do you do that? By talking to each other, by using safety tools, by being good people around a table, by having these 7 etiquette rules. And I think, the wording is, this creates a collegial table environment and often leads to excellent role-playing moments. That is pure outright true. And at your table, everyone thinks of everyone as a good person, as with respect about them, and goes, yeah, that's great. Let me help you. Let's work together on this adventure. That is what you want. You want everyone to work together towards a common goal, with the common goal being, let's have a great session today.
Exactly.
Not let's finish the Demon Lord once and for all. That's what the characters are doing. But at a table, right, you need to think that these rules are all about the table, not the play.
It's GM etiquette and not how would your characters... it's not character etiquette, it's GM etiquette or player etiquette. That's the point. We are still the people playing certain characters or certain environments, certain creatures. But we as the controllers of these things need to have a certain etiquette to enjoy each other's company and to have an enjoyable experience and comfortable experience. So respect is a big thing.
One thing that I think about these rules that needs to be stated is these rules make it out to be that it is your job to be the caretaker of the table as a game master. It is not. You're just the person leading the play experience. This is table etiquette. Most of these rules come from table etiquette, and then what you as a game master can do with the superficial more power that you've been given by the game and the play you have. But generally, you're not more powerful than the players. You're just another person sitting at the table and playing the game with your friends. Yeah. The last thing in these rules is not necessarily one of these 7 rules, but it is stated following these guidelines will enhance your effectiveness as a GM or DM and help ensure that your gaming sessions are memorable and enjoyable for all players involved. And while I think that is true, I don't think that it makes memorable sessions in and of itself. These things just make your tables be fun. These things make your tables be good environments for people to make memorable sessions and fun sessions. Exactly. They are the foundation. They don't make your things memorable in and of itself.
Yeah, but they lay the groundwork for everything that can be built upon it.
Yeah, without them, you can't have memorable sessions because you won't have sessions for long. If you're an asshole to your players, good luck finding players after a few sessions.
Exactly. It's like building in a swamp. You can't unless you... without the building falling over before you lay the groundwork to make it work.
Very great analogy. Very great analogy. So we've read through the 7 rules. They're great rules. I think we both agree on that. There are a few things that we think that could have been different. If we had made these rules, they would have been in there. The rules themselves are great. Yeah. And if you want them, you can find them on Twitter. We're linking them in the description and stuff like that. Great rules. And you should internalize them a bit if you think that you might be lacking one of them. Because they are great. But I think we might be able to add something to these rules. Another rule, the 8th rule, the DoubleDM rule. That is only for us on our podcast, at least. Niels, do you have one?
Yeah, all of these 7 rules were more or less a passive thing that you should bring to the table rather than an active thing that you should do or could do. And I think one of the biggest things that makes a great GM is directly engaging your players. Talk to them directly. Ask them what are their thoughts right now. What do they want to do? How do they want to react to the situation? What is their how does their attack look or whatever? What does all of that mean? Let your players describe certain things and let them or ask them to lead a certain experience. Give some responsibility of experiences to the players directly, not just by creating an environment where they could do that, but directly engaging them. When my GM, when I am a player, directly asks me, "Hey, what are your thoughts on that? What does your character think right now?" Then I'll get into a more what would my character feel? Think about it a second. Telling it out loud and then describing how my character still portrays these feelings, if they portray these feelings, and so on and so forth. That then leads to maybe other players seeing the same thing, thinking about it, telling how they would portray it, then seeing how my character portrays their feelings and then interacting with them, and so on and so forth. Directly engaging one or multiple players at the same time creates amazing moments at the table. That can only be done when you have these 7 passive rules as a groundwork to have a great table and a great experience, because then everybody feels comfortable to do these things. But once you have that, directly engage your players. An active thing that you as a GM can do that makes great etiquette, because you are actively trying to incorporate all of the rules above, to have mutual respect, to communicate with each other, to give away control, give player agency, and have consistency in that.
Yeah, be active is a great next rule, right? Because all of these rules are how you're supposed to guide the experience. These are guidelines for how you should behave. That's etiquette. And another thing is, for me, you should be active. You should be throwing in new things into the mix. You should be making evolving games. You should be making incredibly interesting villains, right? However that means, what that means for you. That is entirely your thing. But being active, right? Being active in the conversation, not just listening. Being part of the play. Making sure that your players stay on their toes. rules leads to a memorable experience. Being active, enforcing, encouraging, bringing in these and other rules, making sure that your game is always fun. Being active is a big part of being a GM, because the GM role isn't reactive, but it is also not just active. But you need to be active to be a good GM. You need to be active in what you do. And that means introducing new things to play, talking to your players, enforcing these etiquette rules, and all of the above.
Exactly.
Just do stuff. Try to make your experience fun. And that is by just doing something. You can't do nothing. That will never lead to good things.
Exactly. And I think with that, we are done for today. Thank you all for listening, and hear you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of DoubleDM. It appears you liked this one. What we had to say and our advice helped you. Why not show us how we helped you in a rating, or even write a review detailing us how we helped? You can do this on the platform that you are listening on right now. It's just a few clicks, doesn't take long, and helps us out. It gets us out there and our advice into more ears of more people. Thanks again for listening and joining us on this amazing journey. Have a great day, and hear you on the next one. Bye-bye.